Imagine settling in close as I take you back to the 1850s, a time quite different, but still full of the little things that made up everyday life. The clinking pan by a creek, the sharp crack of a revolver, the flicker of early photographs capturing moments no one had seen before. We'll talk about the colors of those days, from the homes folks called their own to the songs they hummed on quiet nights, and the news of a war just being told in pictures for the first time. Let's wander through those simple moments together, the kind you'd remember warmly years later. In the 1850s, the rush for gold was a time of dreams and hard work. Folks who heard word of gold in California came with hope weighing heavy on their backs and simple tools in their hands. The most basic way to find that glittering metal was something called panning. Imagine standing knee-deep in a chilly river, holding a shallow metal pan, and scooping up a mix of river sand, gravel, and mud. Then comes the slow and patient work of swirling water around in that pan, shaking it just right to let lighter dirt and stones wash away, while heavier bits stay settled at the bottom. And sometimes, if luck was kind, those bits included tiny flakes or nuggets of pure gold. It wasn't easy work. Your hands would grow numb from the cold water, and the back-breaking crouch over that slow, bubbling stream made every day a test of patience. Panning was the starting point for many. It didn't take much to get started, just that pan and some grit. But gold was hidden not always right on the surface, which meant miners soon found ways to speed things up. Where single pans couldn't handle the amount of dirt needed to strike anything worth talking about, groups of miners would build cradles or rockers from wood. Think of a cradle as a little machine you rock back and forth. It had a sieve to catch bigger rocks beneath and would wash dirt and gravel through with the help of water to catch gold particles. This way, a small team could process more earth than one miner with a pan could alone. It was a clever step up, combining the gentle rocking motion with the swift flow of water, making the hard work a little less lonely and a bit more productive. Another method was the sluice box, a long wooden trough set up along a riverbank. Dirt and gravel were shoveled into these troughs as the river's flow carried the finer material along. Built with riffles or little bars across the bottom, sluice boxes trapped the heavier gold beneath the current, while lighter sand and gravel washed away. This method required teamwork and a reliable water source, but it turned the search for gold into a more organized and efficient effort. For those working in groups, it brought not just gold, but also a sense of shared purpose, each man's labor adding up to something more. While early miners often scratched the surface of riverbeds and stream banks, it didn't take long before more ambitious efforts came along. People dug into hillsides and ancient gravel beds, using pickaxes and shovels to pry gold from rocks and dirt. The work was tough, often dirty, and the rewards uncertain, but hope kept spirits up. For a few, it was a lifetime quest. For many, just a few months before the land called them somewhere else or bills ran short. The gold rush wasn't only about mining tools and techniques. It was also about the daily rhythm of life on the claim. Miners learned to live close to the earth, relying on simple meals cooked over open fires. Beans and salted pork were common fare eaten amid the dust and chatter of a rough camp. When the sun set, stories were shared by firelight, hopeful tales about the next big strike or memories from back home. It was a world stripped down to essentials, where a friend's laugh or a cold drink of water could brighten long, weary days. Yet not all was gold and glory. For every lucky find, there were struggles, fierce storms, bitter loneliness, and rivalries that sometimes ended in harsh confrontations. Claims had to be fought for, sometimes by words, sometimes by force. The world of the gold rush was a mixture of hard work and raw human nature, where fortune and failure walked close beside one another. Looking back on those days of panning and pickaxes, it's clear why the gold rush still holds a special place in the story of those years. It was a time of hope and grit, where simple tools met big dreams. Folks took what they had, a pan, a cradle, a sluice, and with sweat and patience, tried to claim a piece of their future near a winding river or in the dusty hills. Those days weren't just about the gold. They were about the people who braved the cold waters and long roads, believing in the promise of something better. Their stories, full of quiet courage and simple moments, are the heartbeat of that wild, hopeful decade. After the rush began, the gold brought more than just pans in hand. It It brought people, thousands of them from across the country and the world, all drawn by a single hope. Towns that were once quiet outposts or small settlements suddenly woke up, bursting at their seams. San Francisco, for example, was little more than a sleepy place with a few hundred folks there before the gold was found. But by 1850, it swelled to tens of thousands, its streets filled with the sounds of hard work and the hopes of fortune. Imagine walking those streets. A hurried pace, voices shouting to be heard over the clatter of horses and wagons, merchants calling out goods from every corner, the scent of fresh sawdust mixing with smoke from wood fires. Where there was gold, there were boomtowns, and these were places made overnight. Folks built homes and shops from wood planks, pulled up sticks and nails, and erected tents to hold back the wind. It was a wild patchwork of makeshift buildings, saloons painted with bright signs, and jostling crowds of prospectors, storekeepers, gamblers, and families, all chasing fortune or trying to make a living in the chaos. The streets were often rough and dusty, marked by horse and wagon tracks, and the noise never truly settled. People came from far and wide, the East Coast, Europe, Latin America, even Asia. With them came new languages, new foods, and new customs. There was a curious mix of folk thrown together, driven by dreams, but also bound by the need to carve out a life in a place that seemed as wild as the gold in its hills. Life in those towns wasn't easy. There was a sense of urgency, like everyone was caught up in a great race. But there was also something more, a sense of community that began to grow amid the roughness. Men shared stories of the river, the rockers, and sluices during brief stops between work. Children ran barefoot through alleys, their laughter bright against the clamor of dusty streets. When the workday ended, lights flickered behind windows as families sat down to a meal, sometimes gathered in tiny rooms or under makeshift shelters. While these boomtowns promised gold and opportunity, they often brought challenges too. Hotels and boarding houses were packed tight, and prices for food and supplies could be high, sometimes outrageously so. Diseases such as cholera and typhoid made quick rounds through camps where sanitation was poor. Lawmen and sheriffs tried to keep order, but with so many people flooding in and tempers flaring, disputes were frequent. In some towns, justice came quicker than trial, sometimes dealt out at the end of a rope. Yet, amid the chaos, new businesses and industries took root. Stores sold tools and clothes, blacksmiths hammered horseshoes and wagons, and taverns became places to rest and swap news. Post offices bustled with letters and newspapers flying across the country, spreading word of the latest strikes or hard times. Churches and schools were born too, as families settled in and sought to make something lasting beyond the gold rush frenzy. And as the population grew, so did the need for better roads and connections. Ferries and steamboats moved goods and people up and down rivers, while horse-drawn wagons rolled steadily to and from the rapidly expanding towns. The promise of a railroad linking distant lands seemed just around the corner, a symbol of promise stretching far beyond the gold that started it all. These boomtowns might have seemed like flashes in the pan, built on quick fortunes and raw ambition, but their impact was deep. The California Gold Rush didn't just change the landscape, it reshaped lives and wove new threads into the fabric of a growing nation. And in each rough-hewn cabin or bustling street corner, you could feel the pulse of a people chasing their own piece of the future. In that wild, eager mix, ordinary folks found places to hope, to struggle, and sometimes to finally call home. Life at the claim wasn't just about the hard work of digging and panning. It was also the quiet moments around the fire when men ate their meals and shared stories. Most miners lived in tents or rough wooden shacks, where a simple fire stove, if they were lucky enough to have one, was their only comfort against the cold. Meals were plain and practical, usually whatever could be carried or found nearby. Salt pork, beans, and hardtack were staples, things that wouldn't spoil easily and could fill a hungry stomach after a day working cold rivers or rocky hills. Cooking was often done outdoors. A pot of beans bubbling over an open flame, or coffee made by boiling grounds in a tin cup, was as much a comfort as any gold found in a pan. Some miners tried their hand at fishing when nearby streams offered a bite, or hunting with a rifle if they could spare the time. But many relied on what stores and merchants in mining towns could sell. even if the prices were high. Flour cost a small fortune, and fresh fruit was rare. There wasn't much variety, but meals shared in shifting groups around a fire gave a feeling of togetherness that was as important as the food itself. Evenings were when the day's work faded into memory, and the world hushed except for the crackle of firewood and the soft talk of men unwinding. Stories were told about the day's finds, near misses, or the wild characters who passed through camp. Laughter flowed easily. Songs sung low carried the weariness away for a while. When money was tight or luck had run dry, those evenings by the fire were a rare chance to rest and remember home. A letter from family, a face trusted and missed. Gatherings were also a place for sharing news, tools, or even a hopeful partnership. Miners pulled together to build sluices or dig deeper, and these shared efforts brought their own kind of community. It was not all good cheer. There was often rivalry beneath the surface, and competition for the best claims could spark heated words or fights. But for a moment, sitting round the fire, the men set aside their troubles for shared warmth and simple conversation. A miner's life had both hard edges and quiet tenderness. The rough conditions shaped them, yes, but it was the companionship found in those shared meals and stories that steadied the heart when the work was tough and the days long. These gatherings by firelight weren't just about filling empty stomachs. They were about feeding the soul, even in a world of dirt and loud ambition. The daily rhythms of work and rest, hunger and friendship, these defined the miner's days as much as any gold nugget. Those moments, both ordinary and precious, made the days not just bearable but meaningful. And it is these quiet details, the simple dinners and warm evenings, that truly bring that time to life for anyone listening now. They reveal the real heart of the gold rush, that even amid the rush and roar, there was room for kindness, for hope, and for a shared story told beneath the stars. The California gold rush brought hope and fortune to many, but it also carried a heavy cost, a cost felt deeply by the land and by the people caught in its grip. Life wasn't just the rush to find gold. It was also the struggle against nature's wildness and the troubles stirred up among men trying to claim their peace. The work was hard, yes, but the hardships stretched far beyond cold water and aching backs. It began with the land itself. Miners with their picks and shovels might seem small against the vast landscape, but the way they chased gold changed everything. Trees were cut down by the thousands, timber needed for building cabins, sluices, and fuel. Forests that had stood for centuries vanished in a matter of years, leaving bare hills where only dirt and exposed roots remained. With no trees to hold the soil, erosion took its toll. Rain washed the earth away, carrying mud and gravel into rivers once clear and sparkling. The rivers bore the brunt of the gold rush's impact. Many were dammed, rerouted, or clogged with sediment stirred up by mining. Water that once fed fish and crops became heavy with dirt, and entire stretches of riverbed were altered, making it harder for fish to survive. The streams that had offered life now ran thick and brown. Mining waste, or tailings, piled up in piles higher than a man, sometimes covering fields and flooding valleys. Those were the scars of the Great Rush, marks not just on the land, but on the future itself. But the damage didn't stop with the earth and water. The rush emptied forests not only of trees, but also of wildlife. Miners and settlers hunted animals for food: deer, rabbits, ducks, even bears. As populations grew, the land's wild creatures disappeared, shrinking away into the hills or vanished altogether. The quiet woods became quieter still, and the natural balance was lost. The toll was also personal. The gold rush drew a great crowd, men and families from across the globe, but it was also a lonely life for many. Friends lost to accidents or sickness left gaps in the ragged community. The hardships of long days and poor food wore on spirits, and sometimes the pressure boiled over in fights or worse. With no solid law in place, disputes over claims or debts were settled roughly, often leading to violence or vigilante justice. Health was another battle. Camps and towns grew rapidly, without time or knowledge to keep things clean. Disease spread fast. Cholera and dysentery often struck miners and their families, cutting short many lives. Medicine was scarce and doctors rarer still. Death was a frequent visitor in those early years, accepted with a grim quiet. Yet through all of this, there was still hope. Men and women clung to their dreams of fortune and better days. The cost was clear, but so was the promise. Those who persevered laid the groundwork for towns that would flourish long after the gold was gone. They planted roots in wild soil, built schools and churches, and found ways to live beside the land they had reshaped. Looking back, those years may seem a mixture of glory and loss, of gains and what was given up. The gold rush was a time of bold dreams, but also a reminder of the price such dreams can ask. The scars on the land and the stories of struggle remain, a lasting history that teaches how deeply intertwined we are with the earth and with each other. The golden moments were real, but so too was the cost, and that understanding makes the story all the richer for remembering. The mornings in the 1850s began with a quiet simplicity that carried the promise of a new day, even in the bustling boomtowns born from the gold rush. Imagine waking to the faint light filtering through rough wooden shutters or the canvas walls of a tent, the air still cool and heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine from the surrounding forests. Breakfast was often a modest affair, but it was a time for families and neighbors to come together before their day's work stretched out ahead. For many, the morning meal might have consisted of bread or hardtack, a simple, long-lasting biscuit that could survive the journey west, spread with whatever was at hand, maybe a pat of butter or some wild honey if lucky. Bowls of porridge, often made from cornmeal or oats, were common to warm the bellies before heading out into the cold or labor. The kitchen was more than a place for food. It was the heart of home, where warmth from the small stove or hearth chased away the morning chill, and where the sounds of clinking dishes and soft conversation filled the space like a comforting song. In homes larger or more settled than mine, folks might tune in to a local kitchen radio, a novelty at the time that brought distant voices close, offering news, songs, or sermons that connected the small worlds of these towns to the greater outside. This simple device was a bridge, linking people across miles, a reminder that even in a place carved out of wilderness, there was a broader world still turning. The radio was often the backdrop to the morning routine, as pots simmered and children ate quietly, the day's plans running through the minds of those seated around the well-worn table. For miners and their families, breakfast was a practical meal, fuel for a day full of hard labor or long travel. The smell of strong coffee brewed thick and dark lingered in the air, mixed with the scent of frying bacon or salted pork. Sometimes, if the season was right, fresh eggs from hens kept clucking in coops outside could appear on the table, a small treat amid the more commonly rationed canned goods and dried provisions. These morning meals might have been humble, but they carried a weight of hope and routine that steadied the hands and hearts for the challenges ahead. Morning chores followed closely on the heels of breakfast. Water had to be drawn, firewood gathered, animals fed, and tools prepared. The kitchen was the center of these activities, a hub of movement where the day truly began. The smell of baking bread or simmering stew was not just nourishment for the body, but a balm for the spirit, anchoring people to one another amidst the uncertainty of frontier life. The breakfast table was also where news was shared, tidbits from passing travelers, rumors from distant cities, hints of weather changes. Sometimes letters from far-off relatives arrived, bringing news of home and family that helped bridge the miles and months of separation. These moments, often quiet and simple, were a gathering of presence and memory, a chance to hold fast to what mattered before stepping out into the demands of the day. Through this morning ritual, life in the 1850s felt both fragile and enduring. There was a rhythm to these days, a blend of the practical and the familiar that wove people together in the small communities built from scratch. The breakfast table, with its worn wood and humble fare, was a place of connection, a space where people could breathe, plan, and share in the ordinary magic of living every day, no matter how wild or uncertain the world outside might be. This small, peaceful start to the day shaped more than just the hours that followed. It rooted folks in their place, their family, and their shared hopes. It's these simple mornings, full of quiet care and common comforts, that offer a window into a time when life was hard but held together by the steady warmth of home. In those early days following the gold rush, there was something special about a Sunday morning. The week's hard work finally paused, and folks dressed in their best clothes, which might not have looked like much by today's standards. But to them, they were precious, their Sunday finest. Imagine well-worn coats or dresses pressed smoother than everyday wear, shoes polished just enough to shine a little in the morning sun, hats straightened and held carefully, ready for a walk that was about more than just the day's errands. Church bells rang out softly, calling the scattered families and miners from their homes and camps to gather together. It was a sound both familiar and hopeful, signaling a moment of rest, reflection, and connection. The churches themselves were often simple structures, wooden beams, plain windows, but these gatherings filled the rooms with warmth. Inside, neighbors greeted one another with widows, children clinging quietly beside their parents, and miners standing stiffly after a week spent in rough conditions. The steeple's shadow might stretch long across the dusty street, as folks found familiar faces and a place in the wooden pews. The church wasn't just a place for prayers and hymns. It was the center of the community where news traveled, friendships were renewed, and the weight of the outside world could be set aside for a spell. Sermons spoke in plain words, reminding all of simpler truths and offering strength for the days ahead. There was comfort in the routine and the quiet music of hymns, voices rising gently in song, soft against the creak of pews and the murmur of passing whispers. For families, Sunday was often the only time to dress up and venture beyond the immediate worksite, a chance to share a meal afterward or just simply be together. It was a pause from the endless worry over claims, weather, or the worries of the coming winter. Those simple clothes, the church's quiet rituals, and the gathering of familiar faces helped remind folks who they were beyond their work, and that they belonged to a whole, larger than themselves. Outside the church, the streets might fill slowly as people strolled home, stopping to chat or visit neighbors, sharing news or small kindnesses. The sound of children's laughter playing near the town's edges and the smell of baked bread from nearby kitchens mingled with the crisp air. These Sundays, with their blend of solemnity and ease, stitched together the patches of rough living and wild hope that marked the gold rush life. They were small, quiet havens amid the dust and noise, where people looked forward to coming back, week after week, year after year. In those moments, it's easy to see the human need for routine and connection, how even in a land freshly torn open by ambition and toil, folks still held on to the comforts that made a place home. Simple as the Sunday clothes and church bells might seem, they told a story of belonging and faith, hope and community, a reminder that even the wildest dreams needed a calm place to rest. This segment captures the steady rhythm and quiet hope found in the pause of Sundays during the California Gold Rush, showing life beyond the gold and sweat, in the simple acts that wove ordinary days into lasting memories. In the buzz of those early gold rush towns, life wasn't all hard work and worry. In fact, schools soon appeared to offer children a chance to learn and to bring a little order into the wildness. Schoolhouses were simple buildings, often just one room with plain wooden benches and a stove to keep the chill off during cold winters. Inside, the air was thick with chalk dust and the gentle scratch of slate pencils on boards. The slate board was the child's constant companion, a small, reusable surface where lessons were practiced, sums added, and letters formed over and over again. Going to school was a mix of excitement and discipline. Kids with rough hands and sun-kissed faces took their lessons seriously because learning was seen as a way to a better life, beyond the cries of miners and the clatter of wagon wheels. The teacher, often just one for all the children in the town, had to be patient and firm, keeping order in a room filled with different ages and levels. The lessons were straightforward, reading, writing, and arithmetic, but they carried weight. Mastering these simple skills felt like crossing a threshold to something broader, something that connected these young ones to the world beyond the rivers and hills. The school day started early in the morning, often after a brisk walk through dusty streets or along wild trails. Children hung their hats on pegs by the door and settled down to recite lessons from well-thumbed books. Reading aloud was common, the teacher guiding voices through stories or news from newspapers brought for older children. Writing was slow and careful, each letter scratched with care onto the slate, then wiped clean for the next try. Arithmetic problems, like counting coins or sharing food, made the lessons practical and grounded. School was more than book learning. It was also where friendships began and where children learned the rhythms of community life. They shared stories of home and work, played simple games during breaks, and looked forward to holidays or visits from traveling teachers who brought new supplies or music. The schoolhouse, though humble, was a place where hope was planted, where futures were dreamed by small hands gripping chalk and by eyes bright with curiosity. Many families faced hard choices about schooling. In some towns, education was irregular, sometimes skipped when work or weather demanded. But the commitment to learning was strong, rising like a quiet tide beneath the noise of gold pans and sawmills. Those who could send their children to school saw it as an investment in those children's futures, a chance for them to grow beyond the rigors and uncertainties of frontier life. Evenings often found children doing their lessons by candlelight or oil lamp at home, repeating sums or reading aloud to younger siblings. Parents might sit nearby mending clothes or sharing news from the day, the small light flickering against the worn walls holding these moments safe. The sounds of learning blended with the soft creaks and whispers of a growing community, steadying and warm. Those humble school desks and slate boards tell a story of beginnings, a story of how families who came seeking fortune also sought to build a foundation for their children. They captured the hope that stood soft but firm beneath the rush of gold and the wildness of the new land. In those quiet classrooms, amid dust and sunlight, the future was quietly being written, one letter and number at a time. In those early years of the gold rush, life was often tough and lonely, especially for the women who lived far from the comforts of home and community they once knew. But in the face of hardship, women found ways to build connections and carry on the small acts that made a house a home. One of those simple yet meaningful gatherings was the sewing circle, a place where women came together to mend, make, and share not only clothes but stories and support. Imagine women bending over pieces of worn fabric and thread, their hands moving carefully but steadily as they stitched in the fading light of an oil lamp or by the warm glow of a stove. The clothes they mended weren't just for themselves, but often for entire families, patched and sewn to last through rough days ahead. At times, new garments were made from whatever cloth was available. Each seemed a little act of hope and care. These sewing circles were more than just work sessions. They were a lifeline and a way to ease the isolation of the frontier. The women talked softly, sharing news from back east, gossip from town, and hopes for the future. Some spoke of letters they had received or sent. Others remembered birthdays and holidays with a touch of wistfulness. There was laughter too, sometimes quiet, sometimes bubbling and bright, filling the room with a sense of warmth that the cold, rugged land outside could not take away. For many, the sewing circle was also a place for teaching the younger generation. Mothers and older women passed on not just the skills of sewing, but the stories of family histories, recipes, and old songs. It was a moment to pause and root themselves in traditions even as the world around them raced forward in change and uncertainty. Sometimes these circles turned into places of gathering for more than needle and thread. They were spots for planning community events, organizing care for the sick, or preparing gifts for those who had suffered loss. They were the quiet centers of a world mostly run by men chasing gold, a reminder of gentler things and steady hands. By sharing their work and stories, these women built bonds that helped steady families and neighbors through difficult seasons. They turned small stitches and humble fabrics into threads of community and hope. Those sewing circles, humble as they might seem, carried a powerful kindness, a way to say, "We are here. We will endure. We will care for one another." Looking back, it is in these simple acts, mending a tear in a shirt, trading a story, passing on a skill, that the true heart of the gold rush communities is found. The women's hands, busy with needle and thread, were shaping more than clothes. They were weaving the fabric of a life lived together, against the odds, in a wild and hopeful new world. Music was a living thread woven through the lives of folks during the gold rush years, a quiet comfort and a lively joy when the days were long and the work was hard. You might hear it slipping out from the open doors of a cabin or echoing softly across a campfire clearing beneath the stars. The instruments were simple, fiddles mostly, sometimes guitars or the harp, but the songs they played told stories of the land, the people, and their hopes. The fiddle was the heart of much of the music in those times, a familiar and lively companion to dances and gatherings. It wasn't uncommon for a miner or a settler to carry one tucked in a corner or wrapped in cloth, ready to pull out when the day's work ended and the night's plans took shape. The fiddle's quick, sharp notes could lift a crowd, calling feet to dance and faces to smile. The music was often shared folk tunes handed down from old homes across the country, some bright and fast, others slow and full of feeling. It was music that could fill a small room or reach out over valley hillsides, stitching people together with its warm melody. Traveling singers played an important part too, wandering from town to town with their voices and stories. They brought with them new songs from faraway places, told tales of adventure and heartbreak through verse, and sometimes added humor and lightness to heavy days. Their voices carried news in ways both true and tall, a way the folks gathered could hear beyond their hills and rivers and catch wind of the world's wide goings-on. The arrival of printed sheet music in these towns was a small revolution. Suddenly, new songs and dances spread faster than ever before, and those who could read music or had steady hands at the piano brought fresh tunes into homes and halls. Families gathered around to try their hand at singing or playing along, their kitchen tables sometimes turning into stages for impromptu concerts. These moments brought laughter, ease, and a sense of normalcy far from the chaos of the gold fields. Faith and hope found their voice in the hymns sung softly in homes and churches. These songs, full of quiet prayer and comfort, filled the night air and rested heavy hearts. When times were tough or sorrow came close, hymns were the words that carried consolation. They were sung not just with music, but with shared understanding, a reminder that even in the wildest places, grace was near. Music in the 1850s was more than melody. It was a refuge, a gathering, and a memory. It echoed the simple joys and sorrows of those times, the laughter at a dance, the sorrow in a homesick song, the prayers rising with the notes into the night. It's in those strains of fiddle and voice, in the shared songs and celebrations, that we find another piece of the story, one of warmth, community, and enduring spirit in a world full of change. There was something almost unbelievable about the arrival of those first photographs from war. The images that showed people for the first time what fighting looked like beyond the stories or drawings. Before that, war was something known but distant, told in words and sketches that captured moments but not the whole scene. Then came men with large, heavy cameras and glass plates, lugging their equipment across battlefields, setting up in muddy fields or ruined towns. They worked slowly, needing long exposures, and the subjects had to hold still, often under the weight of danger and fatigue. These early photographs brought a new kind of truth about war, somber, raw, and real. The pictures showed not just faces but the aftermath, rows of cannon, abandoned camps, fallen soldiers lying silent on open fields. They were stark and quiet, but packed with the loudness of what had happened. Families receiving these images didn't just hear of battles. They saw their sons and brothers in uniform, saw the places where fighting had torn through the earth. The process of creating these photographs was itself a feat. Photographers faced long hours setting up, mixing chemicals, and carefully exposing plates to light. The equipment was fragile and the chemicals delicate. One wrong move could ruin the entire effort. These men did their work amid uncertainty and often dire risk, knowing that what they captured could change how the world understood war forever. For those at home, these photographs were more than just news. They became keepsakes, objects carrying the weight of love and loss. Families clad them in frames, held them close, and passed them down through generations. These images gave faces to the stories woven around kitchen tables and filled spaces where words fell short. Remembering through these photographs is a quiet kind of reverence. They hold more than scenes. They capture moments of courage, fear, and sacrifice. They are the first ways we saw war, not just as events, but as experiences lived by human beings, with the light and shadows of hope and sorrow marking every frame. In those early, grainy images lies a new story of war, one told in silence, but heard deeply. And it is through these images, carried across time and distance, that we come to know not just the battles, but the people who faced them and the lives forever changed. The journey to the West in the 1850s was nothing short of a trial mingled with hope, stretching every ounce of patience and strength a person had. It started with the simplest reason, dreams of gold, or maybe just a place to call one's own far from crowded cities. The land seemed endless, and the sky stretched overhead bigger than it had ever looked back east. There was a rhythm to it all, one that carried travelers through dust and silence, through long roads and short conversations. Each day began early, in the chill of morning air that clung to blankets and skin, the light sneaking past the ragged edges of wagons covered in canvas and hope. Families packed their lives into wooden wagons, pots and pans and keepsakes crammed tight next to flour barrels and blankets. Children squeezed together with pets under the heavy bows. There was a careful dance to loading a wagon, making sure everything precious fit, but also keeping space clear for the everyday. Food, water, maybe a Bible, or a worn picture tucked away for comfort. Oxen or mules strained against the load, harnessed and stubborn, snuffling along as the caravan bunched up and spread out again over the broken terrain. Sometimes the road seemed nothing more than two ruts cut into the grass, climbing and dipping, never straight. For many, the trip began with laughter and singing, eager voices echoing across the morning mist. But as the hours stretched and the days piled on, the sound of wheels creaking became more familiar than any song. Dust kicked up and settled over hair, clothes, and faces. Shoes wore thin, and the insides of wagons grew heavy with the sharp smell of sweat and fear. People pressed forward, each step a prayer for good weather and smooth passage. The West was a place of dreams, but the path there was one of hard-earned lessons. Meals on the journey were cooked over small campfires whenever the caravan found a safe place to stop. There wasn't much to work with: beans, hardtack, salted pork, the occasional wild vegetable, or game caught by luck. The taste of food grown plain and practical became comfort, even when it leaned bland. Water was gathered from streams and rivers, carefully filtered for dirt and bugs. At night, stories danced around the flickering flames, each traveler offering tales of where they'd come from or why they were heading west. Some stories were old family legends or bits of news from home. Some were fresh and wild, imagination spun to keep spirits high when hunger and tiredness pressed close. But the West wasn't just a story of travelers. It was also about the world itself meeting them head-on. Storms could blow in without warning, flattening tents and dousing fires that were needed most. Wind cut cold, howling through the gaps in wagons and shivering backs long after the sun had set. Rivers flooded fast, and the hard-baked earth could crack underfoot, sending wagons tumbling or wheels spinning uselessly in mud. There was a real hunger in the land, a wild need to keep moving, to not stop too long lest the journey slip from hope to hardship. The trading posts along the way served as brief islands of relief, places that felt almost like towns in their own stubborn way. Traders bustled behind counters crowded with tools and dried goods. News passed quick from the lips of those who had come before. For some, a few precious coins could mean the difference between more salted beef and empty hands. Goods disappeared quickly in busy season: nails, blankets, flour, bullets. There was a quiet desperation in every transaction, each one a small gamble that tomorrow would be easier than today. Partings were common, too. Not every traveler made it all the way west. Sometimes a sick child or a broken axle meant leaving someone behind, trusting the kindness of strangers or the brief hope of a doctor found on the road. These moments stitched a real heaviness into hearts, each farewell adding another line to the faces of those who pressed on. The West asked a price, and sometimes it was more than people expected to pay. Still, through every lost friend and rain-soaked night, the landscape itself taught something about hope and tenacity. Tall mountains loomed with promise and fear. Rivers glittered with what seemed the last sunlight on earth. There were times the journey felt endless, but also times it sparkled with possibility. The moment the first wagon rolled over green hills, camp at last beneath trees that whispered a new kind of welcome. Once settled in the West, days took on a new routine, though just as hard and relentless as before. Clearing land meant swinging an axe from sunrise to dusk. Homes sprang up quick and rough, for walls, a roof, and a hearth for warmth. The world didn't bend easy to newcomers, but with each board hammered and each garden planted, hope grew stronger. Winter came as sharp as it ever did back east, but was met with thicker walls and better fires. Neighbors fashioned out of strangers appeared day by day, folks sharing stories or lending a hand with chores or sickness. Children grew fast, learning to help with the animals and fields, their memories packed with long rides into town for supplies, the taste of fresh bread after months of hardtack, the sound of coyotes in the distance as the sun set. Festivities were rare but cherished. Barn dances brought people from miles around. Women in patched dresses and men bathed and brushed, laughter growing loud and ringing late into the night. The harshness of daily life made these celebrations all the more sweet. The small communities that grew on new ground made traditions of their own. Church bells, sometimes little more than a triangle struck with a stick, marked Sundays and gatherings. Meals were shared after services, neighbors passing around dishes made from the best the land had given that season. Sometimes, news from back east arrived months late, but when it did, people clung to it. Births, deaths, marriages, threading new memories into old. Roads grew out of the miles, stretching from settlement to town, from homestead to the nearest store. Stagecoaches twinned dust behind them, postal riders braving the wild. The arrival of the railroad brought new sounds and ways, steam and iron carving through quiet hills, forever changing the rhythm of travel. Still, the heart of the West was not just in its machinery, but in the hands and hopes of those who built it, bit by bit. Against all odds, the journey west in the 1850s is remembered as much for the dream as for the reality. Yes, there was fortune to be found in gold, and yes, some staked their claims and struck it big. But for most, it was the simple act of building a life from scratch, of holding fast to family, faith, and the quiet joys of a shared meal or a safe shelter. That mattered more than any glittering promise. The road west stitched together thousands of stories, from new beginnings to bittersweet endings. Each settler learned something about hardship and hope. Each wagon left its mark in the dirt, and every night spent beneath western stars became another moment in a world that was slowly, quietly, being remade. And after all the dust settled, what remains is the memory of those journeys, the taste of fresh coffee cooked over a smoky campfire, the feeling of turning one's face toward morning, ready for whatever it would bring. The journey west, with all its trials and small triumphs, is still a story that glows soft and honest in memory. A story of how ordinary people found something grand in the very act of moving forward, together, toward the open, unbroken sky. There's something about the sound of metal striking metal that takes me right back to those days out on the frontier. The Colt Revolver. Nobody called it anything fancy, just the Colt. It was a tool first, though it got its reputation fast as the gun you needed to keep close in a wild place. And even now, I can almost feel the weight of it in my palm, its grip worn smooth by countless hands hoping for a little extra insurance as they walked the uncertain streets of boomtowns. You didn't just pick up a Colt and expect respect. You had to earn it, just like you earned a place by your fire or a claim by the river. Most folks weren't out looking for trouble, but trouble sometimes found you. Lawmen, usually someone who'd been elected or volunteered, the sheriff, maybe, or the town marshal, wore their own gear and badge with a kind of tired pride. They walked the streets with their eyes open, boots stirring up dust, and their hands near their belts, ready for the job. Sometimes a lawman was just a miner with good aim and a steady voice, asked to keep order in a place fast outgrowing its own rules. It was no easy job. There'd be shouting some days, gunfire now and then, and a crowd with their own opinions about where the line between justice and vengeance lay. Vigilantes were never far behind the law. A man wronged or a claim disputed, and soon enough, somebody was gathering folks for a meeting or a posse. Stakes were high, and patience grew thin. Every lesson about keeping the peace came with a story of someone who didn't make it home when tempers flared. People had their own ideas of fairness: a stolen horse, a cheating gambler, a thief caught red-handed. Sometimes justice was swift and rough, decided out under the noonday sun or by lantern light with a circle of eyes and a rope swinging from a nearby tree. But those stories grew and traveled, passed from one campfire to another. They mixed with tales of bandits who'd tried and failed, hard men who'd softened with family, and ordinary folks who'd found themselves in the thick of things they'd never asked for. The long evenings were a time for those stories to settle, for the laughter and sighs to fill the air as firewood crackled and shadows crept higher against the walls. Sometimes the best tales were the ones about little victories, a lawman convincing a drunk to sleep it off instead of fighting, a gambler who'd given up his winnings to a hungry family, or a sheriff who knew every child's name in a fast-changing town. Daily life didn't revolve around the gun, but the knowledge you had one meant something. Farmers, merchants, blacksmiths, they all kept a careful eye, not just on their own business, but on the faces of newcomers moving through town. The revolver stood for more than danger. It stood for the right to defend what you'd built from nothing, the hope that you might see another sunrise and bring home a new story to tell. Still, there was an understanding among old-timers. The gun was the last resort, not the first. Men valued their word, their handshake, the shared drink over a worn saloon counter. Respect came slow, built from days spent working side by side, not from threats or bravado. The towns built up fast, but the lessons in living together took longer. Communities started to find their rhythm. A school here, a church there, market days filled with bustle and the gossip that kept everyone stitched together in one big patchwork. Even as order began to take root, there was no end to new faces. Immigrants arrived with their own ways, their own codes for trust and conflict. Fights over boundaries or business or pride flared up, often ending in a handshake as much as a busted nose. People learned to navigate the tricky dance between law and life, between safeguarding what mattered and letting things slide when letting go meant peace. Lawmen became more skilled at reading rooms, teachers in patience as much as in justice. Yet, the stories of the Colt and the men who carried it are only half the tale. The other half was quieter, found in the steady hands of mothers and fathers who tucked their children in at night, listening to distant song or the hush of their town setting down for sleep. It was the silence after conflict, the chance for healing and forgiveness before another day of building and dreaming. There were moments of real grace, a man laying down his weapon, choosing words instead. Those were the moments that shaped a town as surely as any law or legend could. Bit by bit, the towns began to settle. The wildness didn't vanish. It just found a new place amid the shops and gardens, the laughter that spilled into scrappy streets as daylight faded. Lawmen wrote records, kept ledgers, learned to bargain as much as command. The gun was still there, but now it was part of history, a reminder of what had been risked in the name of hope. Looking back, it's the quiet victories that stand out. The times when men and women put down argument, stood together against danger, and found common ground. Some learned to trust, some learned to forgive, some learned the hard way that peace was worth the slower road. Those were the lessons carried forward, handed down in stories and in living. A real understanding that the cost of safety was more than just a loaded weapon, and that every day spent building life in the West was itself a kind of small, simple triumph. The journey from lawlessness to order is a long one, not just in books, but in daily living. The kind you feel in your bones, the kind that ripples through every handshake and every quiet evening. The Colt and the stories of those who carried it remind us how close the wild and the gentle walk together, how much courage and restraint go hand in hand, and how a community grows from every kindness, every careful word, every bit of trust built slow as the sun rises, day after day. There's a certain quiet that falls when you hold one of those old photographs, the ones with edges worn soft from being passed down or tucked into a family Bible. They catch the lamplight in a special way. The image is slower, softer, and more patient than anything you'll find today. Back then, in the dawning years of picture-making, photography was something almost dreamlike, both a marvel and a wonder, the kind of magic that made the world feel larger and smaller all at once. I remember the first time I heard about men setting up their big box cameras on the fields where soldiers fought. Folks talked about it in whispers, half as if it were a spell and half as though it might steal away some part of what was real. Most of us saw war as something distant, woven from letters and the shaky sketches in newspapers. Then, suddenly, photos began to filter back east, images of men standing stiff beside cannons, the look in their eyes caught forever on a tiny slab of glass or metal. No one really knew how to feel about it at first. Some found comfort in seeing familiar faces looking out, proof of life from a son or brother gone off to some distant battle. For others, it brought home the cost, clearer and closer than any words could manage. The business of creating those images was no easy feat. The men behind the camera, they were half artist, half inventor, tinkering with chemicals, measuring exposure by feel and by guess. Their hands often stained brown or black by iodine or silver nitrate. The camera itself was heavy and stubborn, built like a box with a brass lens, perched on sturdy legs, the sort that refused to budge once you set it down. Each photograph began in darkness, a plate coated with collodion, dipped and tilted and coaxed into readiness. Then, plate tucked into the camera, the photographer would ask his subject to stand very still. Don't blink, don't even think of scratching your nose, because every second of movement risked blurring away the truth. It could take minutes sometimes, not just seconds, before the glass caught enough light. Soldiers and officers, camp cooks and newsmen would all fix their gaze on the camera's cold eye, holding steady as the world spun quietly by. There was a kind of gravity in those moments, a shared hush as if everyone knew something different was happening. And when the plate came out, back into its little nest of darkness for developing, the anticipation was sharp enough to feel in your teeth. The finished picture might be inverted, ghostly, the lines of faces and uniforms all silver and shadow. But there it was, a real memory fixed, proof that someone had stood there, endured, and been seen. In homes far from the noise of battle, these photographs took on a life of their own. Mothers would trace their sons' faces with careful fingers, sometimes smiling, sometimes sobbing long and low when the soldier never came home. Families propped pictures up on the mantelpiece or hung them above the table, a small testimony to endurance and hope no matter what storms came. When friends gathered, they'd lean in to study the images, remarking on how the uniforms looked so stiff, how the faces seemed at once familiar and forever out of reach. The photograph turned every soldier into a kind of quiet hero. In a way, it gave the whole family, and sometimes the whole town, something to remember and to grieve. There were also pictures of places, the battered fences, the churned-up mud, the lonely camps where lean-tos made from canvas struggled against the wind. Some showed wagons overturned, horses milling, officers in conversation, and, sometimes, the aftermath that nobody liked to speak about. These last were the hardest, scenes of fields after the fighting, bodies still as stone, uniforms torn and dirted. Some thought these images were too much, that maybe the camera brought home a grief no one was ready for, but there was an honesty in them that words could never capture. You could see the weight men carried, how war aged them before their time. Despite the heaviness, these photographs brought a kind of connection. For the first time, families knew more than rumor or official word. They could see for themselves. The old fear of waiting for a knock at the door became wedded to the hope held in a photograph that proved someone was yet alive. Communities changed, too. Newspapers began printing copies, and suddenly strangers could share in the burden and hope of distant families. The country became closer by way of every new image. What was once felt only in private now joined in public, a great collective reckoning with the truths of conflict and survival. The impact stretched beyond war, too. As photographers returned home, their tools found other jobs. There were weddings and birthdays, main streets and new schoolhouses caught in soft sepia and sharp gray. The same care was taken. Set the plate, mind your subject, wait for the moment. Towns slowly filled with little galleries, images for sale or on display, each one a piece of history offered up for a penny or a glance. Even farmsteads miles from any city found themselves recorded, a simple family lined up against a barn wall, eyes wide with the wonder of it all. People learned to mark their days, not just with memory, but with pictures. The photo album became a new kind of keepsake, a story told in images, meant for sharing or for quiet company on lonely nights. Families who had never even seen the ocean could own a photograph of a ship or a city, and those who'd lost much could hold on to something no storm or fire could take. The camera was more than invention. It was a way to keep pieces of life, a promise that nothing beloved or brave would ever truly vanish. There's a lesson I carry. seeing how the world changed with that first click and flash of the camera. A lesson about honesty, about the value of seeing and being seen. It was not always comfortable to look. Sometimes the truth on a glass plate was harsh, more real than folks wanted. But there was also comfort in knowing, in holding steady and facing what had come. These photographs made us a little braver, a little more understanding of the weight each person bears. Now, when I think about the old photographs left behind, I don't just see faces or faded uniforms. I see the stories that ripple through generations, the pride, the loss, the joy pressed between shadows and light. They are reminders that every life, whether it lasts many years or ends under a stormy sky, leaves an image that endures, teaching those yet to come how to remember and how to keep loving against all the world's forgetting. That, I suppose, is the heart of why photographs mattered so much even then, when they felt new and wondrous and a bit strange. They let us see ourselves and each other clearer, not just for who we hoped to be, but for who we were, tried and true, holding on when the world felt too large or too far away. Through every photograph, a hand reaches out from the past, steady and honest, and the story it holds is an invitation to remember, to reflect, and to cherish what endures. It's a curious thing looking back on that long stretch through the heart of the 19th century when news, spectacle, and new wonders of travel started shaping everyday life in ways nobody could have planned. The landscape itself, still marked by the gold rush and stitched with new roads and rails, watched as people hurried in and out, each step further away from the old world and deeper into the roar and promise of what came next. I recall the first time a broadside about the penny press found its way to the porch, its cheap paper rough under the fingers, black ink smudging the skin. News wasn't something reserved for the rich or for big city folks anymore. The penny papers, sold by newsboys with arms full of headlines, meant any man or woman with a spare coin could keep up with the world. You'd hear the shout from the street. News of war, of the president, of ships in San Francisco Bay, of gold strikes farther north or droughts down in the valleys. It seemed, overnight, that distant events were neighbors, their troubles and hopes carried into the kitchen or the general store, debated over the counter as much as at the parlor table. Alongside news, entertainment came rolling in, sometimes wild and noisy, sometimes strange and beautiful. The traveling circuses brought creatures no one had seen outside of storybooks. Elephants swaying gently in the dust, big cats lounging in the shade, while folks craned their necks for a first look. There were acrobats, tumblers, and men who'd swallow swords or breathe fires, women flying from swing to swing under the huge striped tent, and crowds gasping, mouths agape, at every new trick. For just the price of a ticket, an ordinary day became a memory, children dashing underfoot, parents holding hands and laughing as wonder lit up tired faces. Compared to the hard, quiet life of miner or farmer, such days felt almost unreal, a breath of fancy in a world measured mostly in hours of labor and miles walked. The railroads, with their iron tracks and belching smoke, felt much the same, like a promise stretched across the earth, carrying with it the hum of modern greatness. Towns rose up along the lines, businesses flourished, and suddenly shipping flour, mail, even livestock wasn't the slow gamble it had once been. What used to take weeks now lasted only days. Families accustomed to the long, weary trudge to market learned to listen for the whistle, gather their goods, and wait by the station platform for news from far away or a parcel sent from home. There's something about the look in a child's eyes the first time they saw a locomotive, a mix of fear and delight, the loud thunder of wheels on tracks, and the steam that billowed up into the sky. Grown men tipped their hats or stood silent at the arrival of that engine, knowing it spelled the end of some old ways and the beginning of something nobody could fully picture. The promise of travel quickened the heart, and soon new hotels, boarding houses, roadhouses, and even the first proud, brick-built inns went up to meet the steady stream of travelers walking through the doors. These places were never silent. Laughter and voices, the scrape of chairs and the clink of glasses, filled the evenings, while mornings were full of hurried breakfasts and plans for the day ahead. Townsfolk mixed with strangers, sailors, salesmen, recent arrivals, old hands passing through. And in those crowded common rooms, stories changed hands as easily as coins. Housekeepers made the beds, cooks fried the bacon, and somewhere in the back a letter was written by candlelight to a family far away, promising soon I'll be home, or telling of luck, hardship, fresh hope found at the crossing of two railroad tracks. Still, not everything was machine, spectacle, and rapid change. There were, in between the noise, moments of pause. In the late warm sun, a man might sit outside the new hotel and listen to music floating on the air, a fiddle played by a porter, or songs sung by a woman with a voice so rich and full you'd swear it must have belonged to someone famous. Those evenings were held tight by memory, the sense of being both a part of history and just a man living through another twilight, grateful for bread, roof, and a cool drink at day's end. Sometimes the world seemed to have more sorrow than it could bear. Word arrived of far-off events, a president shot, a city burned, an ocean storm that sank a ship months before. People gathered in the square or at church to talk it through, faces solemn, some weeping quietly. In those moments, you understood how much you could care about folks you'd never met, how wide the world had become just in the span of a few short years. It changed how people thought of themselves, not as isolated pioneers, but as threads in a tapestry stretching from east to west, across rivers and rails, through triumphs and heartbreak. The businesses that boomed alongside all this new movement were quick to try and keep up. Newspapers ran advertisements for every kind of service, a new telegraph office, the arrival of a patent medicine that promised relief for all you'd suffered, rumors of land for sale, or a fresh mine discovered. Stores sold cheap souvenirs, little keepsakes painted bright with tales of stagecoach chases and railroad achievements. Photographs now showed not just the faces of those you loved, but the sprawling enterprise of a nation in the making, train depots, circus tents, the faces of strangers smiling into the future. And woven into it all was a constant search for connection. People wrote letters as often as their hands could bear, trusting the new post and the rough riders who braved wild country and storms to deliver papers, gifts, and the latest word. A mother's birthday wish, the spare coin saved for a child's shoes, the careful lists of things missed and things forgiven. These little notes, quick scrawls or long, careful paragraphs, joined people close as any road or railroad ever could. When travelers reached their journey's end, whether drawn by promise or weighed down by need, they found themselves somewhere both strange and welcoming. Towns given names after lost homes or faraway heroes, streets laid down in grid or curve, all settled soft and honest against the land. Here, people met, learned to trust, and began building together. The stranger who'd shared a meal at the roadhouse last night might become a neighbor, a friend, or even family by season's turn. Such was the spread of popular culture and travel in those gold rush years, an unfolding drama of small discoveries, large crowds, dazzling arrivals, and humble goodbyes. The world kept getting wider, the distances shorter, and life, no matter how uncertain, beat on with a quiet, resilient joy. Each whistle, each printed sheet, each light left burning in a new built-in. These were the heartbeat of a country learning itself all over again, one day and one story at a time. And, looking back from here, it's those small, thrumming days, half work, half wonder, those brief moments of pause at a train window or the sight of a parade through town, that hold their place the longest. They are the memories that steal back on a quiet night, when the world's turned gentle and the news is just the sound of branches moving soft in the breeze. It's there, in the echo of wheels, the hum of song, and the warmth of company, that all the promises of the West, the hopes, griefs, new beginnings, rest, waiting to be remembered again. When the air grows brisk and the daylight starts to slip away sooner than you remember, there's a stirring that comes over a household, no matter if it stands in the middle of a busy street or on a quiet ridge above a valley. That stirring is the mark of holidays and traditions, and it was as strong back in the 1850s as it is now. Maybe stronger, in a way, because each gathering, each small celebration, was its own act of hope and gratitude wrung from hard earth and long days. The holidays weren't about plenty, though plenty was wished for. They were about drawing near, holding fast to each other, and making do with love where the rest might be lacking. I think of Christmas first, and the gentle hush that seemed to fall in those brief weeks at the end of each year. In the towns, and even the camps, folks tried to make their rough cabins or canvas homes feel something like the ones they'd left behind. That meant bringing in a bit of green, maybe pine boughs twisted around the door frame, a sprig of holly set above the hearth. If you had children, you might hunt up an empty stocking or shape a pouch from a scrap of cloth, hanging it near the fire and hope that St. Nicholas would find a way through dust or snow. Presents were small: knitted mittens, a cornhusk doll, a slice of dried apple, or a bit of candy saved for weeks. Sometimes you'd get a song, a new story, or just an hour of someone's time, sitting close, sharing warmth. Christmas dinner was the heart of it, pulled together from whatever the year had spared. Maybe a roast if you'd been lucky hunting, maybe a chicken or rabbit, potatoes turned golden crisp, maybe only beans and bread, with butter passed around careful and slow. What you ate mattered less than how you ate it. Side by side, hands held for grace, voices rising in quiet song before the last plate was scraped. There was laughter, too, born less of plenty than of relief. Relief that another year had come, that folks were still together, that, for a moment, the world could be soft. Come July, when the land baked dry under the high sun, people gathered for another kind of memory, the 4th of July, celebration of the country itself. Townsfolk would line the main street, waving new flags or what scraps of bunting they had managed to dye blue or red. Children rode on shoulders, women wore their best bonnets, and the square rang with fiddles and song. There were parades made from wagons decked out with ribbons, men on horseback, sometimes a little pageant or a reading of the Declaration by the preacher or the mayor. If powder could be spared, someone would let off a few rounds in salute. If cakes could be baked, they'd be sliced and handed out, a taste of sweetness under wide blue skies. These were times set aside to remember sacrifice. Old soldiers might take pride of place for the speeches or stand quiet, hats in hand, remembering all they'd given. The Harvest Festival was another kind of gathering, one that spoke to the deeper rhythms of earth and time. When the wheat and corn had been brought in, the hay stacked high, apples stored, and squash lined up on the shelves, neighbors would come together to mark the end of work and the start of rest. Dances were held in barnyards, the floors swept clean, lanterns hung from beams and posts. There'd be food in plenty, at least for a day: pies, roasted meat, jars of preserves set out for sharing. Music played deep into the night, laughter and stories rising in the comfort of full bellies and shared toil. It was a chance to honor the land and the hands that worked it, to give thanks that nothing had been lost to drought or flood, to promise help to any who'd found themselves less lucky. Weddings wove themselves into the fabric of all these days, bright points of hope scattered through the passing seasons. Often simple affairs: a preacher found, neighbors gathered, a dress borrowed or made up new from old. Sometimes they happened in secret, run tight with the excitement of youth and the shyness of first love. Other times they took the full town, everyone pitching in, making it a reason for music, for dancing, for feasting late into the darkness. The new couple would be sent off with gifts of food, quilts, or a helping hand on a homestead. And for a few precious days, every heart beat with the promise that joy was not just possible, but belonged to anyone who dared to reach for it. But not all tradition was wrapped up in grand moments. Some days were marked by the small, steady habit of lighting a candle for a lost loved one, the quiet ritual of sweeping the porch each morning, the recitation of an old prayer, or the telling of a favorite story. Birthdays, for all their scarcity of cakes or gifts, were honored with a song, a cup of strong coffee, a gentle embrace. Sundays carried their own weight: a slow walk to church, the sound of a bell borrowed or begged for, the congregation's voices weaving together in plain song. It was as if, in the uncertainty that colored every day, people leaned more fiercely into the things that could be counted on: the touch of a hand, the taste of good bread, the comfort of long-told tales. If grief came, as it often did, the town or camp would gather in. Neighbors arrived with food, with stories, with a promise that sorrow shared was sorrow lessened. The rituals of mourning: black armbands, a hymn sung at the graveside, a special plate left at the feast in a loved one's memory, helped knit hearts back together in the face of loss. In all of it, Christmas, the 4th of July, the harvest, weddings, funerals, plain Sundays, and unexpected blessings. There was the same spirit. Life embraced in the moment, remembered in the retelling, treasured in the small traditions built day by day. When you look back across the years, the shimmering hope and comfort of these gatherings outshine the hardships. Children remembered the taste of molasses cake more than the ache in their legs. Mothers held tight to the sound of laughter in a crowded kitchen. Fathers cherished the sight of families safe under one roof. And so, as the seasons turned and years unwound, these holidays and traditions carried families and neighbors through. They taught patience, gratitude, and the deep sweetness of belonging to a place, to a family, to a country still new and full of becoming. When the world outside seemed too wide or too cold, it was these old joys and old customs that warmed hearts, pressed hands close, and reminded everyone that, for all the change the gold rush had brought, the real riches were always found in coming together, in lifting up the ordinary, in celebrating the everyday courage that made each new year worth welcoming. If you ever found yourself waking before sunup in the 1850s, out there, with the gold rush in full swing and 1,000 new lives taking shape, you'd know that every day carried a rhythm born of simple routines and the kind of steadfast hope that can only be stitched together over time. Mornings were never quiet for long. As the sky paled, the familiar sounds would start. Water pails knocking together, the steady scrape of shovels, voices rising and falling as folks checked the weather or planned the day ahead. The world was older then, somehow slower even when it was bustling, and though news kept trickling in of fresh strikes or new inventions back east, each life tilted on its own small axis. You could see it best around the breakfast table, each house or shanty or tent cobbling together its own version, meager sometimes, hearty at others. Even the poorest found ways to make meals matter. Men and women sitting, shoulders brushing, sharing bread with honey or coffee boiled strong enough to wake your heart. Children, spotted with dust and the rogue shine of yolk dribbling down chins, learned manners from habit and the sleepy admonishments of mothers as the day's work called louder. There was a grace in these early meals, a sense that, no matter the chaos outside, these small gatherings were a circle of safety, of belonging. After breakfast, life tugged everyone outward. The gold rush towns, especially, spun on the axle of hard work. Men shouldered axes or picks and trudged to claims, boots slick with mud, faces set with hope and a little fear. Others marched off to run shops, smithies, or help bring in freight along the roads, joining in the patchwork effort that built up a town. From nothing more than need and hunger. Even those without steady work, widows, old-timers, the sick, found ways to contribute, lending a hand where it was wanted, weaving the fabric of the place tighter with every act of care. Children went about their own business, sometimes to school, sometimes to errands or chores, always learning the quiet lessons of community and survival. A schoolhouse wasn't just a place for arithmetic. It was the social hearth for the young, the forge of friendships made over chalk-dusted slates and oil-stained benches. Play, too, softened the edges of life. A game of marbles, hopscotch beside the river, the raucous call of Red Rover as the sun lengthened in the sky. Midday meals and quiet rests came quick, sometimes together, most often apart. Miners broke open biscuit tins by creeks, clerks stole bites behind counters between sales, and schoolchildren ran home carrying stories of the morning's lessons. The whole town seemed to hush for a blink, gathering breath before the long stretch of afternoon work pressed on. It was then that the homemakers, those keeping the peace and warmth of every settlement, set their shoulders to sewing, canning, tending gardens, wrangling young children, making each home a sturdy refuge. Afternoon carried with it the great weight of ambition, the sense that the day must yield something: gold, good sales, new fences built, beans hoed and weeded. Folks measured their success not just in gold dust, but in small victories: a fence line that held, a pail of fat berries gathered for supper, a clever trade at the store, a letter received from family hundreds of miles away. These were ways people made meaning out of effort, marking time by hands and hearts as much as by sun or shadow. Evenings became sacred almost by accident. As tired bodies returned home and light faded, there was a slow gathering at doorways and porches. Suppers, while simple, filled the air with the good smells of cooked meat, potatoes, and sometimes the rare luxury of stewed tomatoes or a slice of pie. Laughter came easier then, loosened by the day's end and the gentle promise of a few hours without work. Neighbors might wander over, drawn by a lamp's glow or the faint tune of a fiddle. Families sang together or read aloud if there was a book to spare, and the little ones drifted to sleep wrapped in quilts patched and repatched, every square its own story or memory. Sundays stood out as more deliberate, more precious for being rare. No matter the creed or background, it was a day for clean shirts, polished boots, hair brushed till it shined. Church bells or simple triangles called folks together, uniting them in song and prayer. The rituals of community, shared meals, congregational singing, long talks after the service, kept loneliness at bay and let people lean against one another through loss and joy both. Sometimes, the preacher's words were less memorable than the comfort of a friend's squeeze on the shoulder or the sight of every seat filled, a living tapestry of hope, grief, faith, and endurance. Holidays, as the years wore on, were what stitched seasons together with meaning. Whether harvest, Christmas, weddings, or simply folks gathering for a dance beneath paper lanterns, each tradition was a bulwark against forgetting what mattered, who had come before, what they had endured and made possible. Stories passed around the fire, repeated until they fit each generation's worries and hunger for reassurance, served as teachings when no other wisdom could be found. The world was changing quick outside those small lives. Telegraphs buzzed, newspapers multiplied, railroads thundered through, and with each change, new challenges arrived. But morning to night, routine to holiday, people adjusted, preserving their own rituals while incorporating whatever progress allowed a better life. Babies born in tents grew into teenagers with calloused hands, proud of the new homes their families had built. Old couples, having survived a wilderness of hardship and hope, watched the world transform and marveled at how sweetness flourished despite, sometimes because of, all the struggle. That's the memory that lasts longest now, not the gold, the lawlessness, or the noise of towns rising and falling, but the unglamorous, faithful threading of days. The chop and spill of water at the well, the smoke from evening fires, the murmur of voices in a house whose windows fogged on winter nights as laughter and song tried to outpace the wind. The way sorrow and celebration danced together in kitchens and streets, always holding space for both in the lives of those who stuck it out. And when the last lamp was turned down, when roads slept under the hush of nightfall and the world stilled at last, folks rested in the knowledge that tomorrow would look much the same. There would be chores calling, hands ready, the familiar faces of neighbors seen knee-deep in their own hope and worry. If that isn't the true measure of fortune, the ordinary day, lived fully, with patience and the gentle certainty that one's heartbeat joined 1,000 others, forming the perfect, peaceful rhythm of life, then I don't know what is. So it was, so it remains, that in the smallest things, in the rhythms we make for ourselves, happiness and meaning are found and carried forward, one sunrise to the next. The music that floated through the 1850s wasn't always planned. Sometimes it just happened, a whistle cutting through the still of morning, a tune carried on the wind, hands working in rhythm as the day got underway. But in those days, when life was built less on luxury and more on hope, music held people together, soothed their worries, and filled the quiet corners between one day and the next with the simple joys that words couldn't always reach. The sound of a fiddle often led the way, a familiar instrument worn shiny in the right spots, its strings forever fighting for tune in the shifting weather. There might be a banjo, a guitar, maybe even a harmonica tucked into a shirt pocket or sitting atop a packing crate. Even those without instruments learned to stamp their feet, clap their hands, or hum along when evening came. If you weren't the musical sort, you listened, your smile growing as the notes gathered friends and strangers into an easy circle. The music was never grand, but it was honest, and it made a hard world feel a little easier. When celebrations came, whether harvest, birthdays, or those rare dances held in a barn swept clean and hung with paper lanterns, the musicians found center stage. Folks brought food to share, wood for the stove, and every hope for a night without care. The dances weren't practiced. Not really. They were made from memory and whatever joy could be found in two sticks tapped together or a worn heel scraping the dust. Laughter spooled out in long, warm threads. Young couples learned the shuffle and twirl. Old men rocked slow and sure. Women joined in, their voices high in a song pulled from childhood days or distant lands left behind. Music followed the working hours, too. Songs lightened the load as miners shoveled and sifted, farmers hoed and harvested, mothers and daughters nursed babies and hammered out bread on the kitchen table. Old tunes spoke of home. New ones rose up from fresh hopes and heartbreaks. Sometimes a ballad would surface, telling of far-off loves or lost fortunes, stuck in the heads of every listener and sung quietly as they walked back from the field. Hymns joined in, old favorites passed down from churches back east, or the hymnal brought cross-country with little more than faith and a handful of coins. In the rough chapels and humble gatherings, those songs washed over crowds, mending sorrow and sharpening dreams with every note. Traveling performers brought excitement, too. News of a singer, a small band, or a clever storyteller with a pick and a poem rippled through the hills and valleys. Their arrival meant stories told with a tune, laughter bristling in the firelight, and everyone squeezing in close to catch every note. Sometimes the old hands would shake their heads at a wild new rhythm or a cheeky verse, but more often than not, the whole room found a common thread in the music, no matter where it came from. Sheet music slowly trickled west, as printmakers found their way into new towns, stacking songs atop the family Bible and a scattering of letters from home. These slips of paper, torn and faded, let anyone who could play offer up something different, a hymn, a reel, a waltz. New songs stitched into old music, and families spent long hours by lantern light working through a tune, laughing at missed notes, and carrying on until the world felt safe enough to sleep. On Sundays, music filled church and camp, sometimes swelling so strong that it seemed to lift every heart. Voices joined in, sometimes ragged, sometimes sweet, but always full of longing and faith. Some towns had choirs, some just a few voices. Every hymn, every song told a story, healed an ache, and let folks glimpse grace for a moment, brushing aside worry and weariness with simple sound. Hard times called for music as much as celebrations did. When storms rolled in, crop failed, or sickness stole through the neighborhood, tunes rose up just as strong, songs of survival and encouragement, little lullabies for children kept up by fever, ballads for those lost along the way. The community gathered close, singing softly so the world couldn't slip too dark or empty, reminding everyone of the power held in a shared melody. Some music was just for dreaming. As dusk trickled in and work fell silent, people rested on porches or under the big sky, humming songs to soothe and remember. The tunes were simple and strong, holding old secrets between their notes. The memory of home, the ache of first love, the laughter of friends gathered in the glow of a lantern. Music became the way folks marked the passing of time, the changing of seasons, the steady and sweet reminder that their lives, for all the bustle, still moved gently forward. The fiddlers and singers, the stampers and hummers, the mothers who rocked babies in time, and fathers who kept tune with clanking tools, all became the keepers of a tradition far more lasting than any gold found or law laid down. The songs they carried, the music they made was stitched deep into every heart, a steadying presence against hardship, a ready companion in joy. If you take time to listen, you can still hear the echoes, the slap of a boot heel in dust, the rise of voices in harmony, the familiar melody swelling from an open window, mixing with the scent of bread or the coming rain. Those were the moments that proved, again and again, that music needs little more than hope to rise, needs little more than honest hands and willing hearts to fill a space with light. Music in the 1850s didn't need grand halls or expensive instruments. It needed only people, hungry for joy, pressed close by trouble, holding tight to the promise that every sorrow and every celebration could be tempered, remembered, and magnified through melody. The songs shaped the days, filled the empty places, and became the heartbeat of every family, every gathering, every long night waiting for morning. So when the world seemed wide and wild, when new roads stretched out and hope felt just out of reach, Music was the lantern everyone carried inside. It helped folks remember who they loved, what they had gained or lost, and how sweet it could be to share a moment of harmony in the midst of a restless, growing land. For all the change, all the struggle, all the dreams of gold and new beginnings, it's the music that remains, the golden seam threading every memory, every year, drawing us back to the heart of those simple, hopeful days. There's a feeling that settles in when you talk about the journey west, a sort of quiet weight mixed with old wonder. It's not just the distance or the hardships that come to mind, not just the names of trails or the numbers stacked up on the miles. It's the way people moved, not always fast, never easy, but with a steady kind of hope that could outlast any thunderstorm or dry spell. If you start from the beginning, you see it was rarely a decision made quick. Parting up what you owned, saying goodbye to a house that was maybe crowded or maybe already grown old in memory, was a slow unwinding of roots. The wagons only looked grand in stories. In truth, they were cramped and plain, perched on wheels that groaned under the weight of flour barrels, cast iron stoves, tin dishes, a quilted comforter, a precious Bible, the odd family picture, and dreams crammed everywhere in between. Morning on the trail came not with chicken or clock, but with the pink edge of sunlight spilling across camps high with the smell of bacon fat and scorched coffee. The grown-ups moved first, unrolling bedding, shaking off sleep, setting the fires, and starting pans to sizzle. Children followed, sleepy and shivering, yawning into their sleeves and slipping out to tangle barefoot with other little ones. There were always chores before you got going. Water to draw, animals to feed, packs to tighten, yokes to lift with shoulders already aching from yesterday's pull. Travel, once it began, was little more than a long patience, broken by the occasional shout or startled laughter, the wheels bumping through ruts, the dust billowing. Sometimes you'd see another wagon tail, distant and small, and old stories would get swapped. This one lost a wheel, that one pitched a tent just in time to beat the rain. Dogs barked, mules brayed, children sang nonsense, and the sound of plodding hooves became almost a lullaby to tired ears. It wasn't always peaceful. Sky could turn in the space of a sigh. Calm mornings swept away by sudden dark, wind rising and swirling grit through every crack in canvas. Rain could flatten camps, threaten supplies, soak matches, and test every trick a family had ever known about staying dry. Then there were river crossings, cold, dangerous, at times chest-high, so you'd strip down and push, hearts booming like thunder, praying wagons stayed afloat and oxen didn't bolt or founder. Sometimes the water took something precious, sometimes it only left you wetter, but always it left a story. Mealtimes were moments of rest. Salt pork and beans, cornmeal mush, biscuits cooked in the ashes. When luck turned good, there'd be wild onions or a plump rabbit, trumped in importance only by clear water. Around the fire, grown-ups told tales of other crossings or of far-off cities. Children listened, eyes growing big in the firelight, and dreamed of California or Oregon or just a patch of dirt to call their own by day's end. Disagreements crept in. Who would lead, which fork in the trail to take, whose turn it was to patch a wheel or stand guard. But more often, burdens were shared. One man's strength patched another's weakness. A woman lost her loaf tin, another lent hers. A child grew sick. The caravan slowed so medicine and kindness could catch up. Every night, the circle closed around its own losses and gains, everyone belonging by necessity, if not by previous acquaintance. Some left markers along the way, stones piled, names carved, a piece of bright fabric streaming from a tree. It was a sort of lonely hope, believing that someone from before or after might recognize a sign, take heart from proof that the road could indeed be crossed. Burials sometimes happened in hush and haste, prayers whispered into morning. Even lost, even heartbroken, folks rose to move on. The land did not wait. Crossing mountains was hardest. Days could pass slow, wagons lined up like broken teeth on switchbacks, men wedging rocks under wheels to spare axles. Once on the other side, the world opened wide, rolling grass or desert as far as you could see. Spring meant mud and floods. Summer, heat and snakes. Autumn, the dread of early snow. And always the sky, so big you sometimes felt small enough to disappear below it. Near the end, every hardship seemed worth it. even the moments you'd thought would break you. There were shouts when landmarks rose up, the first glint of a river, the line of a new town, the sweet stink of ripening fruit on a wild tree. Folks who'd traveled so long in one another's company now slipped away, peeling off to find their land, to build the first fire on a new patch of earth. Life in a new settlement brought its own mix of relief and new challenge. The land needed tending, a shelter built by hand, seeds pushed into stubborn earth, livestock penned and watched sharp for wolves or coyotes. Water had to be found and drawn. Neighbors, once rare, could be suspicious or a source of sudden aid. Even in winter, trapped by snow and hunger, hope never dried up completely. Spring brought new things out of the ground and out of people, buried strength, quick forgiveness, big laughter. Newborn babies joined the din just months after the wagon stopped, their wails a sure sign that life was winning out. Trade routes grew along the paths of the old trails. Posts and stores popped up along rivers and at wide crossings, first tents, then lumber walls, then the proud red brick of a general store or tiny post office. With each new family, the sense of belonging grew. Town meetings gathered under trees or at the back of a store. Disputes hashed out neighbor to neighbor. News passed quietly or sometimes in a rush when danger came from outside. Children grew quick and rough and full of promise. They learned the land, the ways of animals, the shape of the seasons by heart. School might wait for winter or for the arrival of a more settled teacher, but learning never did. Stories, wisdom, and skills passed mouth to ear, one generation to the next. You could read the mark of the journey in how people treated their tools, how they guarded their health and kin, and how they learned to trust only after the hardest lessons. Faith found a place too. The little churches built from community, not stone, meetings in homes, hymnals borrowed or shared, faith cobbled together across denominations and traditions. It wasn't ceremony that mattered, but the joining together of voices and hearts, the constant prayer, whispered or sung, that a new spring would bring gentler days, and that loss would be measured always by the depth of new joy. Harvests, when they came, were cherished more dearly for every risk survived. Festivals, simple but lively, grew up around the first pulling of potatoes, the last sheaf of wheat. Music and laughter stitched every gathering. Candles burned late, and guitars passed hand to hand. There was no forgetting the lean times, but in the new world, every table carried echoes of both want and abundance. And always, in every story, there was an ending. Sometimes it was a letter gone east, bearing hope and news. Sometimes a grave tucked quietly beneath a favorite tree. In every ending was another beginning, the slow, stubborn proof that families, once broken by distance and fate, could heal in the new soil of the West. If you ask what defined the journey, the great march west and the slow setting down, it wasn't conquest or any solitary act of luck. It was the accumulation of little mercies, a hand extended, a song shared at dusk, the comfort of stories told in the cold, the understanding that every hardship was lessened when divided, every hope richer when spoken aloud. That's the legacy written not in gold or in history books, but in the quiet memory of footsteps pressed deep into the dust, in the hearts of those who kept moving, who built, who loved, and who kept the story alive. The journey west was never easy, rarely simple, but it was always together and always, for those who made it, a thing worth remembering. The law on the frontier rarely came written or clean. It was a dustier kind of order, the sort shaped by handshakes and warnings, by stares across a campfire, and by the constant hum of neighbors learning to live alongside one another. For the folks who walked those dirt roads, what kept peace wasn't always a sheriff's badge or the clang of a jail cell. Sometimes, it was just the quiet agreement that you needed more friends than enemies, and that sometimes, silence was its own kind of justice. Men carried the revolver with caution and pride, a symbol as much as a tool. Nobody wanted trouble, but everybody knew it could come. Days unfolded slow. A morning spent sweeping the porch, patching a boot, resetting a fence post, interrupted, maybe, by a distant shout or the sound of hoofbeats drawing near. Every gun in its holster meant another pair of eyes watching the world for something out of place, another ear bent close to gossip and rumor. The towns grew by habit and necessity, never by grand design. and each house or shack or saloon marked the land as much by its stories as by its foundation stones. Sheriffs arrived in many ways, not born to the badge, not always eager. Sometimes they showed up by vote, sometimes by accident, handed the star on a day when two men started fighting over a claim and there was no one else willing to step between them. You could spot a lawman by the set of his shoulders, his careful walk, the slow, deliberate way he greeted everyone, friend and stranger alike. Some wore their authority light, hoping never to use it. Some learned quick that keeping order meant more words and patience than gunfire and wrath. Not every battle was public, nor every reckoning swift. The law learned to bend. Reckonings happened in whispers. Old men settling disputes at a store counter, young folks squabbling in the dust before making up over supper. Patience kept tempers in check most days, but now and then, history snapped tight. When gold went missing, when cheating turned public, when families felt threatened by wild spirits rolling in from the edges of town. When the official law failed, vigilantes stepped up, as they were bound to do. Sometimes a group would form, faces grim and voices rough, to restore what felt lost. They'd ride out at dusk or stand together in silent agreement. Justice, as they saw fit, came quick and sometimes sharp. A thief run out of town, a scoundrel sent packing, a warning left for anyone thinking of crossing the line. These weren't moments of pride, usually, but of necessity. When danger flickered close, even the gentle found themselves hard. Yet, the fireside stories that endured were never about fear alone. The best tales featured men and women who held out for compassion, who took chances on forgiveness, who found a way to settle things with laughter before fists or bullets. People learned from each other, trading caution for kindness when the world allowed it. A sheriff might solve the worst troubles with a cup of strong coffee and a word spoken soft in a dark parlor. Sometimes, the folks who arrived seeking vengeance left wiser, choosing the long road of peace instead. Children watched it all, soaking up the lessons not found in schoolbooks. They saw how people weighed pride against community, how a single handshake or apology could tip the scale between feud and friendship. They grew into young adults who understood the risks, the price paid for every act of courage, every loss mourned in quiet. The law became not just a matter of guns or threats, but of collective will, neighbors backing each other up, refusing to let drift or despair take root. As the weeks turned to years, order found form in records, in ledgers, in careful notes kept by the sheriff or town clerk. New codes took hold, and talk of justice moved from porch steps to official meetings, star-tucked in the glow of lanterns on long winter nights. The rules got clearer over time, but the spirit of those early days persisted, laws that made room for grace as much as for consequence. Not every challenge came from within. Towns faced drifters and outsiders, people swept in by the tidings of gold or the promise of fresh start. Old hands eyed newcomers with suspicion, but also with the secret hope that they'd stick around, learn the lay of the land, become friends in the end. Rivalries crossed boundary lines, claim disputes, land wars, worries about water or food. Every rough patch demanded patience, and every solution taught someone how to give, how to trust, how to wait. Against this backdrop, everyday life continued in its own rhythm. Shops pushed open their doors, blacksmiths hammered, farmers planted more beans or corn. Children played beside the creek, mothers swapped recipes, fathers tried their best to teach by example how to be fair and firm. Each week brought new stories, some hard, some bright. Births, deaths, marriages, new families scattered among the old. The revolver on the belt softened into history. Lawmen wrote letters home, took up other trades, sometimes handed the badge to sons or nephews. The violent edge dulled, not vanished, not forgotten, just tamed by slow, reliable peace. Old arguments buried themselves in the ground with every handshake shared at a harvest festival, every laugh dug up at a Sunday dance or church dinner. Looking back, it's easy to see the constancy that shaped the towns, the balance struck again and again between risk and reward, between confrontation and forgiveness. The law of the frontier became the law of people, imperfect but strong, ready for whatever came. Those who lived it, endured it, and outlasted the storms knew something deeper than any written rule. And through all of it, the stories remain. the standoffs that ended in laughter, the fights that fizzled out with a word or a drink, the kindness that shielded the weak and taught the strong a lesson or two. The towns grew quiet and solid, packed with friendships built out of shared survival, with the slow, careful hope passed from old hearts to new. That's the truth I hold close now. Less about the noise, the violence, the threats that seemed so loud at the time. More about the ways people learned to look out for each other, to build a life layered with trust and the gentle understanding that, in the end, it's the ordinary acts, the patient reconciliations, the faith in simple decency, that makes a place feel like home and keeps its stories worth telling for generations to come. You ask me about everyday life at home in the 1850s, and I find myself drifting back through the comfortable haze of ordinary days, where the world turned slow and the business of living was made up of tiny patterns. Work, rest, laughter, 1,000 small kindnesses stitched together over time. The house might have been little more than rough planks, uneven floors, and a stove puffing smoke out a rain-rusted pipe, but it was steady shelter. You learned to trust a place by its warmth when the wind rose, and by the way sunlight thickened in its corners by late afternoon. Our mornings began with hush and habit. The soft knock of a kettle, the creak of floorboards under slippers cobbled together from leftovers, the whisper of muttered prayers as the fire caught. Breakfast wasn't grand, never needed to be. Bread, gravy, sometimes an egg if the hens were kind or the fox kept away. Coffee was boiled until rich and bitter, mugs filled and passed around the table as voices woke and plans unfurled. Children squabbled over last crumbs, and grown-ups traded stories of what needed doing. Patch a fence, tin the garden, check the smokehouse for signs of mice or mold. The daily work followed close, as natural as breathing. If you were lucky, you'd have a bit of land, a garden out back, rows of beans, potatoes, maybe tomatoes tied up with string if there was room in the soil. You'd weed, sweat, and wipe your brow with your sleeve, stopping now and then to watch the clouds for rain. Laundry came in its own season, boiled in pots, scrubbed against boards, hung to dry in the breeze. Clothes lasted longer when mended, and scraps kept safe, turned into quilts, patches, doll clothes, or rags to keep windows clean. Inside, the heart of the home was its kitchen, warm and always faintly busy. The stove never fully cooled. There would be soup simmering, biscuits rising in tin pans, pies set aside from the last apples of summer. Spices, whatever you could get, cloves, cinnamon, maybe bay leaves, brought by a neighbor or ordered from the city. Every meal was an act of sharing, of trust. Little ones hovered underfoot, reaching for a taste, learning the gentle art of waiting. Afternoons belonged to rhythm and routine. You mended clothes that tore at seams, wrote letters on pale paper, hoping the post would reach your kin back east before the first snow set in. Women gathered for sewing circles, their voices low and determined, fingers flying as the day waned. Gossip was traded, news of births, marriages, fresh woes, or sudden joys. Someone might bring a new story about a neighbor's good luck, another voice would break with laughter, and for a moment, the world felt lighter. Children found themselves between chores and simple pleasures. They ran wild through fields, collecting bugs, frogs, or fallen bird nests. They learned the wild lore of the land, names of trees and rivers, where berries grew, how to spot a change in weather before the adults. Some learned to read by candlelight, tracing out words slow and careful, reciting hymns alongside old tales patched together from memory. School was not always near, not always certain, but learning flourished with every story told around the table or beside the fire. When dusk crept up, the house gathered close. The evening meal pulled everyone together, hands washed, hair combed, clothes straightened best as could be. The food was plain, the portions careful, plates always scraped clean, leftovers saved. It wasn't just about filling your belly. It was about the talk, words soft or lively, sharing the day's troubles, marking laughter, feeling the weight and warmth of what had passed. The stove kept burning, candles lit when night fully fell, and the familiar, gentle hum of quiet work continued. Clearing, washing, fixing what needed mending before sleep. Sundays made a different sort of home, a trace of grandness weathered by repetition. Church might mean a clean shirt, polished boots, hair parted neat. Families walked together through early light, picking fresh flowers to press into small bouquets, singing as they went. The meeting house was a gathering point, where sermons mixed with song and the company of neighbors soothed worries better than any medicine. Sometimes a picnic followed, blankets spread, baskets unpacked, laughter and tales traded under the watchful sun. There were days set aside for special work, pickling, preserving, gathering logs for winter, butchering after a successful hunt. These weren't solitary tasks, but group affairs. Houses filled with noise, hands busy, faces red from effort and joy. Every success, every jar lined up, every barrel filled, became community property, passed out in lean days, celebrated in abundance. Birthdays, holidays, weddings, funerals, each left their own soft imprint. You marked birthdays with a song, a small cake, or a favorite dish. Holidays stitched together old customs, evergreens at Christmas, a big feast at Thanksgiving, even a simple ribbon tied to a dress for the 4th of July. Weddings filled the house with light, new dresses, hurried talk, and pride so bittersweet everyone wept behind quick smiles. Funerals were quieter, marked by black bands and whispered comfort, but the rituals soothed sorrow, gathering everyone possible in the healing. Neighbors played as much a part in daily life as family. If you were sick, someone came by with soup and a story. If you needed timber, help appeared, axes sharpened and spirits prepared for long work. Arguments might circulate now and then, but more often, grudges failed in the face of old friendships and the shared need to weather the world together. And then, there were the nights, slow, gentle, marked by music. A fiddle might play, a harmonica draw notes through the dusty air, voices raise in song. Tales spilled out, half remembered or invented anew. Laughter joined by the occasional hush when a sad story called for it. Little ones curled up under blankets. Grown-ups listened as dreams and memories swirled. The music wasn't fancy, but it was real, lifting, lightening, promising that tomorrow would find them still together, still strong. Looking back now, all the grand stories pale beside these ordinary days. It was the daily weaving, the knowing of faces and chores, the comfort of routines and rituals that made life at home worth every struggle, every uncertainty. The walls, however thin, kept the world at bay. The table, however worn, kept the family together. And the memory of those gentle days, rich in nothing but honesty and plain love, makes every year afterward seem fuller for having been lived with so much determination and hope. If I'm to tell you true about the cost of dreams and the hard bargain struck in the dust and wild of the 1850s, I'd begin with the simplest of things. What was given up, what was fought for, and how the land itself were the story of thousands of folk chasing something they thought would change their lives. The gold rush was never simply about gold. It was about survival and struggle, hope cutting sharp as a winter wind, and the kind of hardship that makes a person lean either on their wits or on each other. Long before most set foot on gold country, they reckoned with loss. There was letting go of family, old neighbors, farm plots they'd seeded for years, the churches and schoolhouses where generations sat in the same sunbeam across spring after spring. Some never saw their hometown again, so they carried pieces in every letter, every story told by lamplight in new places that never quite fit like the old ones did. Those first days, the lighter cost came in coins and comfort. Tools and gear priced sky high, shovels, pans, picks, cost 10 times what they had back east. A simple meal that once stretched a family now cost enough to make grown men blink. A bed in town meant a day's pay, and most learned to live with less than had ever seemed possible. Less food, less privacy, less rest. Tents and crude shacks were home enough for a world gripped by hurry. You faced hunger more regular than luck, learned how to patch boots with bark, how to sleep lighter with strangers on all sides, how to share a meal out of kindness as much as necessity. But even as neighbors pulled together, not all were honest or fair. The cost lay not just in money, but trust. Rivalry was sharp, sometimes deadly. Folk fought over claims, over water rights, over nothing more than sour words or suspicion. Law, when present, walked with danger. Men made decisions quick, sometimes by a handshake, sometimes a glance over a pistol barrel. Vigilance took a toll on the spirit. Sleep came hard, and every morning you double-checked that what you'd sweated for was still yours. The land, too, groaned under the weight of so many dreams. Trees felled for lumber left hillsides threaded with roots and rock, nothing green as far as the eye could wander. Rivers once clear and shallow ran thick with mud and tailings, their banks cut deeper with each passing week, their currents slowed or lost to dams and new channels. Streams that had been the veins of forest and meadow for lifetimes now twisted strange and choked. Salmon failed to run. Land slid after heavy rain, taking with it the hard work of a season, sometimes taking the new-built hopes of a town as well. Animals were hunted quick, their numbers vanishing. Deer, bear, and even smaller rabbits or grouse grew scarce. Some days, you'd see children come home empty-handed, only stones in their pockets. The wild harvested to nothing for hungry men and sold to whoever waved money first. The birds, too, quieted over the years. Where once spring mornings rang with their calls, silence and the echo of axes grew more common. You might think it an odd thing to mourn in a time when everyone ran so quick after fortune, but even the hardiest hearts missed the old world's easy plenty. Sickness followed, as it always does when too many are crowded together without care. Cholera, typhoid, fever, they swept through camps leaving thin faces and shivering limbs behind. Water drawn from ruined streams did more harm than good. Sanitation, a word most never knew until they needed it. Doctors came, and when if they came at all. Home remedies and faith got most folk through, and quite often, neither proved enough. The cost could run deeper yet, settling in the heart and the mind. Loneliness, sharp and thin as hunger, visited men and women alike. Loved ones left behind grew smaller in memory, and every day unspooling without word brought a new ache. Children grew without cousins. Mothers buried babies who would never know the sweet wildness of the place that carried their family's hope. Grief cut its own path, rarely spoken of but always present, a shadow that sharpened the lines of every smile. Yet hope didn't die. Hope never does. The same grit that cut furrows in a man's hands built schools and churches, sparkled in rough-strewn laughter at the end of a bitter day, pulled strangers into neighbors, neighbors into friends. Hardship became the glue binding the desperate to their companions. Each small act of compassion, every shared loaf or hauled bucket, carved meaning out of the plain struggle. Communities began to take root as the years moved on. What had been scattered camps found a slow order. Stores, meeting halls, post offices. Where children ran, school bells followed, church bells soon after. Men swapped picks for plows, panning for wheat as much as for gold. Women claimed gardens and flower patches where stumps had once stood. Holidays and weddings stitched families together, and little by little, the world grew less wild. Nature never fully forgave those first years, might never. Towns born of hope sometimes fell to disaster. Flood, fire, landslide, drought. Some lives ended alone, dreams never found, but more saw themselves remade by the hardship. Patient, resilient, kinder. The land, for all its wounds, gave back what it could, and families learned to work with its new rhythms, tending what was left as something precious. In the end, it's the small, quiet endurances that last. Not the gold tally at some city broker's desk, but the story of a family making do, the memory of a meal shared, the echo of kindness when all hope seemed gone. The cost of dreams was steep, but not without reward. A reward counted not in coin, but in the grit of spirit, the depth of love, the strength to start again. And as the years stretched on and children's children listened to the old tales, it was not the glitter of gold that shone brightest in the telling, but the ordinary warmth of lives forged and held together by the price they chose, again and again, to pay. You ask about sewing circles and stories, and how housewives kept the threads of life together in the 1850s. Well, I see those days most clearly whenever I hold a bit of patchwork or remember the long evenings when lamps burned until the last scrap was sewn. Life then was rough, and every scrap of cloth meant something. You didn't toss a shirt that tore. You stitched it up, you passed it on until it could be quilted into a blanket or a rag. The business of mending was the business of caring, and in that world, women found not just work, but company and purpose, and no small amount of comfort. The day might start with chores, the sweep of the broom, water fetched and food set to simmer. But there'd come a time, after noon or in the hush before supper, when a handful of women would gather with baskets at their feet and needles in hand. Some brought old shirts, some fresh scraps from new bolts traded at the general store, others just thread, thimbles, and stories anxious for the telling. The work moved quick and steady, hands flying, mouths just as busy. Something about sewing made truth slip out, in drops and in laughter. They talked of everything and nothing. A child's funny remark, the trouble a neighbor was having with the pigs, who'd got a letter from home, who was still waiting. News traveled in these circles much faster than it ever did through town. News of babies and illness, new arrivals and plans for weddings. You learned to measure a season not by the calendar, but by the color of the thread and the pattern in the quilts. The men worried after fortunes. The women wove the daily warmth of the world. For many, the sewing circle was school as much as anything. Little girls watched and learned from older hands how to set a hem, how to knot a thread, how to patch so well you'd hardly spot the mend. Old stories bubbled up with each lesson, tales of growing up in a different state or country, the way a grandmother did things, songs half remembered and tried out in the quiet. Older women could recall whole lives measured in stitches, a wedding dress sewn with hope for a better future, shirts patched for a man who'd never returned from the East, a quilt finished just in time for a baby who arrived early and strong. Sometimes there was more than sewing. These circles planned church socials, prepared baskets for the sick, sent out comfort when a family lost a loved one. They became the center of community care, tying together not only seams but hearts. The quiet efficiency, how a task shared cut through loneliness, how a problem halved by advice seemed not so large, changed more lives than gold or law ever did. There was power in a circle, and it was gentle but certain. Every so often, the work would turn festive. If winter closed in and light grew scarce, they'd string pieced cloth on the walls, save up sugar for tea, invite neighbors for an afternoon of stories while needles danced. The music of talk and laughter, the rhythm of tasks done together, filled every crack in a cold house. The children would sit on laps, learning the songs and tales, and the old would watch with quiet pride. The circle grew ever wider as the town did. Newcomers, shy and uncertain, found welcome at the sewing table. Friendships formed over the first shared pincushion, hearts mended alongside torn cuffs and frayed collars. Holidays saw gifts exchanged, shawls embroidered for a neighbor's wedding, baby clothes made for a new arrival. The best quilts could become stories all their own, each square a memory, each line a promise that life would remain stitched together even as time pulled people far apart. Some days, the hum of sewing would rise and fall to the tune of the world's changing news. A sermon or a rumor, a letter reporting a hard winter back east, the arrival of rail or telegraph, they talked it all through. Their hands kept steady, and their voices carried the community forward, settling worries, fixing plans, sending hope each way the world might take them. When sorrow came, illness, death, bad luck, the circle drew tighter. Girls would stitch black bands for mourning, and women would sit close beside one another, speaking softly, sharing tasks, bringing food and comfort. The threads ran deeper, becoming not just lifelines for clothing, but for spirit and soul. The worst burden laid down for a spell among gentle hands. By night's end, if not fixed, the world felt lighter. Through long summers and deep winters, sewing circles stayed at the heart of what was good. The sound of needles, the quiet music of shared work, became part of every home's memory. The best stories about bravery, kindness, foolishness, heartbreak, laughter were told and retold, traced into the quilts and shawls that warmed generations. A child napping beneath a quilt had no need to know every old tale, but could feel the grace running through every stitch. When you wonder what really kept towns alive, the schools, the gardens, the law, don't forget the circles that grew in kitchens and parlors, the hands that made and mended what gold could not buy, the voices that kept the old stories alive and taught new ones by example. Proverbs stitched into every hem, love tucked into every patch. Life didn't come easy, but with every stitch and story passed around those circles, the joy and strength of shared living proved harder and far sweeter than any hardship ever thrown their way. So that is what remains, carried forward, The patchwork world of sewing and stories, the loving labor turning thread into comfort and trouble into laughter, making every day less lonely and each winter warmer, holding families and neighbors together long after the gold rush had faded, and all that remained were the long, gentle stories and the warmth of a good quilt.